ballroom of the Pierre Hotel was a sea of bespoke tuxedos and designer silk, but all Naomi could hear was the rushing of blood in her ears. Across the room, her husband, the man who kissed her forehead that morning and claimed he was boarding a flight to Phoenix, was handing a flute of champagne to a blonde woman in a backless crimson gown. That wasn't the twist. Husbands cheat. That's an old, tired cliché. The twist was resting against the mistress's collarbone. Sparkling under the grand chandeliers, dripping with generations of Naomi's own blood, sweat, and history, was the Washington family's most sacred heirloom, the $1 million Empress sapphire. He brought his side piece to society's biggest night, draped in his wife's family fortune. Naomi Washington Brown was a woman who commanded a room not by demanding attention, but by simply existing within it. She was striking, a dark-skinned black woman with high cheekbones, an effortless posture drilled into her by a childhood of cotillions, and a mind sharper than cut glass. Naomi was the sole heir to the Washington estate, a legacy built from the ground up by her great-grandfather, a self-made titan of real estate who bought up commercial blocks in Phoenix and Atlanta during the 1940s when banks wouldn't even look his way. The Washingtons were black American royalty. They summered in Martha's Vineyard, had a generational pew at Abyssinian Baptist Church, and sat on the boards of museums. Richard Brown, on the other hand, was charming. He was a white, blue-eyed corporate attorney with a jawline out of a menswear catalogue and a pedigree that looked good on paper but lacked the financial backing to match the aesthetics. He came from a family of New England academics, rich in tweed jackets and historical anecdotes, but decidedly poor in liquid assets. When Richard met Naomi at a charity gala hosted by the Metropolitan Museum of Art 5 years ago, he was a junior partner at Sullivan & Cromwell, drowning in student debt and desperate to climb the social ladder. Naomi had been captivated by his relentless ambition and his seemingly unwavering devotion. He didn't just love her, he worshipped her. Or at least, he worshipped the life she provided. Their wedding at the New York Botanical Garden was a spread in town and country. They moved into a sprawling, 6-bedroom pre-war apartment on the Upper East Side, a property owned outright by the Washington Trust. Richard drove the Porsche. Naomi paid the maintenance fees. To the outside world, they were the modern power couple, the merging of old black wealth and sharp, new-age legal prowess. But marriages are rarely what they seem from the sidewalk. The cracks began subtly, as they always do. It started in their 4th year of marriage. Richard, who had recently been made a senior partner, suddenly became a ghost in his own home. There were late-night strategy sessions that lasted until 3 in the morning. There were weekend golf trips to the Hamptons with potential clients who never seemed to materialize into actual accounts. Naomi, deeply engrossed in managing her family's philanthropic foundation, gave him the benefit of the doubt. She was an independent woman. She didn't need a husband breathing down her neck 24/7. Then came the financial anomalies. Naomi kept her personal accounts, and the family trust strictly separated from Richard's finances, a non-negotiable clause instituted by her father before his passing. However, they shared a joint operating account for household expenses. Naomi started noticing strange, inexplicable withdrawals. $5,000 here, $12,000 there. When she casually brought it up over Sunday brunch at Balthazar, Richard didn't miss a beat. "Oh, darling, I meant to tell you," he had said, smoothly buttering his brioche. "I hired a private wealth consultant to look into some aggressive offshore tech investments. I used the joint account for the retainer. Just a temporary float until my quarterly bonus clears. You know how these Silicon Valley guys are. They want cash up front." Naomi had nodded, though a quiet alarm bell rang in the back of her mind. Richard was a lawyer, not an investment banker. He was notoriously risk-averse. Why the sudden interest in high-risk tech? But the most glaring red flag wasn't the money, it was his scent. For 3 years, Richard had exclusively worn Tom Ford's Oud Wood, a gift Naomi bought him every Christmas. But on a rainy Tuesday in November, he came home smelling like something distinctly feminine. It wasn't cheap perfume either. It was Maison Francis Courcdian's Baccarat Rouge 540. It was sweet, cloying, and undeniably female. "You smell different," Naomi had remarked, taking his coat in the foyer. Richard froze for a fraction of a second, a micro-expression of panic that Naomi caught instantly. "Ah, yes. I was stuck in the elevator at the firm with a rather overly perfumed paralegal for 20 minutes. I think it seeped into my pores." He laughed it off, leaning in to kiss her cheek. "I'm going to hit the shower. God, I missed you." Naomi watched him walk down the hallway, the pristine illusion of her marriage beginning to fracture beneath her feet. She wasn't a woman who panicked. She was a Washington. Washingtons did not throw hysterical fits. They gathered data. They built a case. And Naomi was about to become the lead investigator in the trial of her own marriage. Before we get to the night that shattered everything, one must understand the gravity of the Empress sapphire. It was not merely a piece of jewelry. It was a tangible piece of Naomi's ancestral triumph. Commissioned in 1952 by her great-grandfather in Paris, the necklace was a masterpiece crafted by a master jeweler at Van Cleef & Arpels. At its center sat a flawless 45-carat cushion-cut Ceylon sapphire, a deep, mesmerizing oceanic blue, surrounded by a cascading web of internally flawless diamonds set in platinum. It was heavy, both physically and historically. Her grandmother wore it when she met Martin Luther King Jr. Her mother wore it at her inauguration as the first black woman on the board of the city's largest bank. Naomi had worn it exactly once, on her wedding day. The necklace, along with a matching set of diamond drop earrings and a vintage Rolex President that belonged to her father, was kept in a state-of-the-art biometric floor, safe hidden beneath the false bottom of her custom mahogany closet. Only Naomi had the fingerprint access, or so she thought. 3 weeks after the perfume incident, December rolled into Manhattan, bringing with it the frenzied social season. The pinnacle of this season was the New York Philanthropic Society's Winter Gala, an invite-only event where tables cost $50,000 and the guest list was tighter than Fort Knox. Naomi, as a prominent philanthropist, naturally had a table. On the Tuesday before the gala, Richard came into the kitchen, his brow furrowed in a perfect pantomime of disappointment. He was holding a stack of legal briefs. "Naomi, I am so incredibly sorry," he began, sighing heavily as he poured himself a black coffee. "The Jenkins deposition just got moved up. Opposing counsel is playing hardball. I have to fly out to Phoenix on Thursday night, and I won't be back until Sunday." Naomi paused her stirring. "Phoenix? Over the weekend?" "Richard, the Winter Gala is on Saturday. We've had this on the calendar for 6 months." He walked over, wrapping his arms around her waist from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder. "I know, baby, I know. It kills me. But this case is the linchpin for my managing partner bid next year. If I don't go, Arthur is going to hand the promotion to that weasel Greg. You can still go, of course. Take Vivian. Drink too much champagne and bid on a trip to Tuscany for us." Naomi kept her face neutral. "Of course, work comes first, I understand." "You're the best wife a man could ask for," he murmured, kissing her neck. Thursday evening arrived, and Naomi watched from the living room window as Richard's black town car pulled away, presumably heading to LaGuardia Airport. The apartment felt suffocatingly quiet. On a whim, driven by a nagging intuition she could no longer suppress, Naomi walked into her sprawling walk-in closet. She pulled back the cashmere rug. She entered the 4-digit bypass code and pressed her thumb to the biometric scanner. The heavy steel door hissed open. Inside sat her velvet jewelry boxes, stack upon stack of them. She reached for the largest one, the midnight blue velvet case stamped with the faded gold crest of the Parisian jeweler. She didn't intend to wear the Empress sapphire to the gala. It was far too ostentatious for an event where she was supposed to be asking for charitable donations. She just wanted to look at it, to feel the weight of her family's resilience in her hands when her own life felt so incredibly fragile. She popped the golden clasp. The box was empty. Naomi stopped breathing. The silence in the closet grew deafening. The white satin lining, where the massive sapphire usually rested in its custom indentation, was bare. Panic, icy and sharp, spiked in her chest. She tore open the other boxes. Her father's vintage Rolex? Gone. The diamond drop earrings? Gone. A pair of heirloom emerald tennis bracelets? Gone. She scrambled backward, her back hitting the racks of her silk blouses. Her mind raced through the impossibilities. A robbery? No, the apartment had top-tier security. The building had a doorman and private elevator access. The safe hadn't been forced open. It had been opened with the correct bypass code. A code she had written down on a piece of encrypted stationery in her home office desk. A desk Richard had full access to. She sat on the floor of her closet for a full hour, the empty velvet box resting in her lap. The reality washed over her in cold, brutal waves. Her husband hadn't just been stealing thousands from their joint account. He was systematically looting her family's heritage. The pieces missing were worth north of $3 million. He didn't just betray her marriage. He was dismantling her legacy. Naomi didn't cry. The women in her family were not bred to weep over thieving men. She slowly stood up, placed the empty box back into the safe, and locked it. She picked up her phone and dialed her private security contractor, a former Mossad agent named Gideon, whom her father had retained years ago. "Gideon," Naomi said, her voice eerily calm, "I need you to run a flight manifest for all flights to Phoenix out of JFK, LaGuardia, and Newark for tonight. Look for Richard Brown." 20 minutes later, Gideon called back. "Mrs. Brown, your husband is not on any manifest to Phoenix. However, my team tracked his town car. He didn't go to an airport. He was dropped off at a luxury high-rise in Tribeca. I have the address. Thank you, Gideon. Keep a tail on him." Naomi hung up the phone. He was in the city, with another woman, financed by her money. She walked over to her vanity mirror and looked at her reflection. The dutiful, supportive wife was dead. In her place stood the heir to the Washington Empire, and she was going to war. Saturday night arrived with a bitter, biting chill that swept off Central Park. The Pierre Hotel was a fortress of golden light and exclusivity. Valets scrambled as a parade of Maybachs and Bentleys deposited the elite of Manhattan onto the red carpet. Naomi arrived not with her husband, but on the arm of her best friend, Vivienne Dupont, a formidable Vogue editor with a tongue sharper than a stiletto. Naomi had told Vivienne nothing of the empty safe or the fake Phoenix trip. She needed to maintain absolute composure. She wore a custom, stark white Tom Ford column gown with a plunging neckline, her hair slicked back into an immaculate bun. She looked like an avenging angel, though no one else knew it yet. They entered the grand ballroom. It was breathtaking. Thousands of white orchids cascaded from the ceiling, and a 12-piece orchestra played a subtle jazz rendition of Cole Porter. Waiters glided through the crowd, carrying silver trays of caviar and Dom Perignon. "Darling, you look lethal tonight," Vivian purred, handing Naomi a glass of champagne. "It's a shame Richard had to miss this. Who knew depositions in Phoenix were so critical in December?" "Yes," Naomi said, taking a slow sip. "A terrible shame." Naomi circulated through the room, greeting board members, smiling for the society photographers, and making small talk with tech billionaires and hedge fund managers. She was performing her role flawlessly, but her eyes, cold and calculated, were constantly scanning the perimeter. Gideon had texted her an hour ago. "Target is on the move, headed uptown, dressed in formal wear." He was coming here. The sheer audacity of it made Naomi's blood run hot. He was coming to her event, an event where she bought the table, assuming she would be too busy hosting and networking at the front of the room to notice him slipping into the back with his dirty little secret. He wanted to give his mistress a taste of high society, completely banking on his wife's distraction. At 9:30 p.m., the orchestra took a brief intermission, and the low hum of hundreds of wealthy voices filled the space. Naomi was standing near the grand ice sculpture near the rear bar, when the mahogany double doors of the ballroom swung open to admit latecomers. Naomi turned. There he was. Richard. He was wearing the custom Brioni tuxedo Naomi had bought him for their anniversary. He looked impeccably handsome, a smug, satisfied smile playing on his lips, and clinging to his arm was a woman. She was young, perhaps 24 or 25. She had the kind of manufactured, Instagram filter beauty that was common in certain circles of the city. Bleached blonde hair styled in loose waves, a tiny, surgically perfected nose, and a body poured into a cheap, aggressively sequined crimson dress that screamed new money, or more accurately, no money. This was Chloe Harrington, though Naomi wouldn't learn her name until later. Naomi froze behind the ice sculpture. The world seemed to drop into a vacuum. The chatter, the clinking glasses, all of it muted. She watched as Richard leaned down and whispered something into the blonde's ear, making her throw her head back in a loud, unrefined giggle. But it wasn't the girl's face that made Naomi's heart stop. It wasn't the way Richard's hand possessively gripped the girl's lower back. It was her neck. Resting against the cheap fabric of the crimson dress, heavy and brilliant, was the Empress sapphire. Naomi's vision literally tunneled. The massive 45-carat salon sapphire caught the light of the crystal chandeliers, flashing its deep, mocking blue across the room. Surrounding it, the flawless diamonds glittered like shattered glass, and there, dangling from the girl's ears, were the matching diamond drop earrings. Furthermore, catching the light on the girl's wrist as she clutched her sequined clutch, was Naomi's father's vintage Rolex President. He hadn't pawned them. He hadn't sold them to fund his secret life. He had taken the Washington family's most sacred artifacts, pieces of jewelry that represented decades of black excellence, struggle, and triumph, and he had draped them over his 20-something mistress like cheap party favors to impress her. A visceral, violent wave of nausea hit Naomi so hard she had to grip the edge of the bar to steady herself. It was one thing to cheat. It was a completely different universe of disrespect to adorn the other woman in the stolen crown jewels of the wife he was betraying. "Naomi, are you all right? You look like you've seen a ghost," Vivian said, suddenly appearing at her side. Vivian followed Naomi's gaze across the room. She squinted, her sharp editor's eyes focusing on the couple near the entrance. "Is that Richard?" Vivian gasped, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "What is he doing here? Who is that walking tragic mistake with him? And wait. Vivian's eyes widened in sheer horror. She knew the history of the Washington jewelry. She knew what was in that vault. Naomi, is she wearing the Josephine star? Yes, Naomi said. Her voice didn't shake. The shock was already metabolizing into something much darker, much more dangerous. She is. I am going to kill him, Vivian hissed, slamming her champagne flute onto the bar, her manicured claws flexing. I am going to walk over there, rip that necklace off that little tramp's neck, and strangle him with it. No, Naomi said sharply, catching Vivian's wrist. Vivian looked at her, bewildered. Naomi, he is parading his mistress in front of half of Manhattan, wearing millions of dollars of your stolen property. You are going to let him just stand there. Naomi watched as Richard guided his mistress toward a secluded VIP booth in the far corner, clearly intending to stay hidden in the shadows, sipping free top-shelf liquor while he thought his wife was busy. He looked so incredibly pleased with himself. He thought he had outsmarted everyone. He thought he had conquered the Washington fortune and the young blonde all at once. If we make a scene now, Naomi said, her voice dropping an octave, cold as liquid nitrogen, he plays the victim. He'll say it's a misunderstanding. He'll say he borrowed it to get it cleaned. He will lie, and the scandal will be about my public meltdown, not his thievery. Naomi turned her back on her husband and the mistress. She picked up a fresh glass of champagne. So what do we do? Vivian asked, practically vibrating with rage. Naomi took a sip, her dark eyes locking onto the reflection of the ballroom in the mirrored wall behind the bar. We don't make a scene, Jen. We make a spectacle. He wants to show off my family's wealth. I'm going to let him, right up until the moment I lock him in a cage for it. She pulled out her phone and sent a single text message to Gideon. Target is in the room, wearing the stolen assets. Do not approach yet. Call the NYPD 19th Precinct. Ask for Captain Miller. Tell him Naomi Washington is reporting a grand larceny in progress at the Pierre. Naomi slipped the phone back into her clutch. The trap was set. Now she just had to walk over there and spring it. Naomi's heels clicked against the polished marble floor of the Pierre, a slow, rhythmic metronome counting down the final minutes of Richard Brown's carefully constructed life. The orchestra was playing a sweeping waltz now, the strings swelling in the background as Naomi navigated through the sea of tuxedos and ball gowns. She moved with the predatory grace of a lioness stalking a wounded gazelle in the tall grass. Vivian trailed a few paces behind, a silent, impeccably dressed witness ready to watch the execution. In the far corner of the ballroom, tucked behind a velvet rope meant to keep the general elite separated from the absolute elite, Richard and Chloe were completely oblivious to the approaching storm. Richard was leaning in, murmuring into Chloe's ear, his hand resting high on her exposed thigh beneath the table. Chloe was throwing her head back in exaggerated laughter, sipping a lychee martini, the Empress sapphire glittering like a beacon of stolen valor against her chest. Naomi stopped 3 feet from their table. She didn't clear her throat. She didn't yell. She simply stood there, radiating an icy gravitational pull that eventually forced Richard to look up. When his blue eyes locked onto his wife, the physical transformation was instantaneous and absolute. All the blood drained from Richard's face, leaving him the color of wet ash. His jaw went slack, his hand violently jerking away from Chloe's leg, knocking over a crystal water goblet in the process. The water spilled across the dark linen tablecloth, dripping onto his polished Brioni Oxfords. Naomi, he choked out. The name sounded like it was scraping against sandpaper in his throat. Chloe, annoyed by the sudden disruption of her attention, turned her heavily contoured face toward Naomi. Her eyes, framed by thick, artificial lashes, swept up and down Naomi's custom Tom Ford gown. Chloe's expression morphed from irritation to sudden, dawning terror as she recognized the woman from the framed photographs in Richard's office. "Richard," Naomi said, her voice perfectly modulated, pleasant and carrying just enough volume to be heard over the orchestra. "What an absolute delight. I thought you were trapped in a deposition in Phoenix, battling for your managing partner bid. Imagine my surprise to find you here, enjoying the gala after all." Richard scrambled to his feet, his napkin falling to the floor. He tried to plaster on his courtroom smile, but it looked more like a grimace. "Darling, the opposing counsel caved. The deposition ended early. I flew back this evening. I wanted to surprise you. I was looking for you." "Were you?" Naomi tilted her head, a shark smelling blood in the water. She took a slow, deliberate step closer. "You must have been looking incredibly hard, considering you bypassed the front tables and hid yourself in the darkest corner of the VIP section. And you brought a guest." Naomi finally turned her full, devastating attention to Chloe. Up close, the girl looked even younger, her skin glistening with a nervous sweat that was ruining her setting spray. "I don't believe we've been introduced," Naomi said, extending a single manicured hand. "I am Naomi Washington Brown, Richard's wife." Chloe didn't take the hand. She looked frantically at Richard, her chest heaving. I'm Chloe. Chloe Harrington." "Chloe," Naomi purred, letting her hand drop back to her side. "What a lovely name. Do you work at Sullivan and Cromwell with my husband?" I'm a paralegal," Chloe stammered, shrinking back into the leather booth. "Ah, the overly perfumed paralegal from the elevator," Naomi noted, a thin, razor-sharp smile playing on her lips. "I recognize the Baccarat Rouge. It lingers." Richard stepped around the table, positioning his body between Naomi and his mistress, attempting to lower his voice to an urgent, panicked hiss. "Naomi, please. Let's step outside. Let's go to the coat check. I can explain everything. This isn't what it looks like." "Oh, Richard, I think it is exactly what it looks like," Naomi replied, her voice remaining at a pleasant, conversational volume. Several heads at the adjoining tables were beginning to turn. The elite of Manhattan possessed a supernatural radar for scandal, and the frequency emanating from the brown table was deafening. But let's not rush off. The night is young, and I simply must compliment Chloe on her exquisite taste in accessories. Naomi stepped around Richard, ignoring his outstretched arm, and leaned down slightly toward Chloe. "That a necklace?" Naomi said, her dark eyes locking onto the 45-carat sapphire resting against Chloe's collarbone. "It is truly breathtaking. Vintage Van Cleef & Arpels, 1952. Cushion-cut Ceylon sapphire surrounded by internally flawless diamonds. It looks so incredibly heavy. Is it heavy, Chloe?" Chloe swallowed hard, her hand instinctively coming up to touch the stones. Richard gave it to me. For my birthday." "Did he?" Naomi gasped in mock delight. "Richard, you absolute romantic. I had no idea you possessed such an eye for high jewelry, especially since you've been complaining about your credit card limits for the past 6 months. Tell me, Chloe, did he also give you the diamond drop earrings?" "Yes," Chloe whispered, her eyes darting toward the exits, realizing she was trapped in a social snare she didn't have the pedigree to navigate. "And the watch?" Naomi pointed a long, elegant finger at the gold Rolex President slipping down Chloe's wrist. "That is a very rare piece. 1980. Custom dial. It looks remarkably like the one my late father wore every day of his life before he passed it down to me." The colour completely vanished from Chloe's face. She looked down at her wrist, then up at Richard, her voice trembling. "Richard, what is she talking about? You said these were from your family's estate. You said your grandmother left them to you." Richard was hyperventilating now. The veneer of the suave, untouchable lawyer was gone, replaced by a cornered, desperate animal. "Naomi, stop it. You're making a scene. Let's go home right now. I will give you whatever you want. We will figure this out behind closed doors." "We don't have any closed doors left, Richard. You opened them all when you bypassed my biometric safe on Thursday," Naomi said, the pleasantness finally evaporating from her tone, leaving nothing but glacial rage. "I have no idea what you're talking about," Richard lied, his voice cracking. "You're confused. You've had too much champagne. Those pieces belong to my family." "Your family?" Naomi laughed, a dry, humorless sound. "Richard, your family's most valuable asset is a rusted Volvo in Connecticut and a collection of tweed blazers. My great-grandfather bought that sapphire in Paris before your father was even born. That necklace has a laser-inscribed serial number on the platinum clasp that matches the insurance documentation currently sitting in my email inbox." Naomi took a half-step back, her eyes sweeping over the pathetic pair. "You didn't just break your vows, Richard. You broke into my vault. You stole my father's watch. You stole my grandmother's necklace. And you hung them on a 24-year-old paralegal you've been funding with my money." Chloe let out a strangled sob, finally realizing the magnitude of the situation. She reached up, fumbling blindly with the clasp of the necklace, desperate to get it off. "I didn't know. I swear, I didn't know it was yours. I don't want it. Take it off, Richard. Take it off." "Leave it on," Naomi commanded, her voice suddenly cracking like a whip, halting Chloe's hands in mid-air. "Why?" Richard pleaded, his hands running frantically through his perfectly styled hair. "Just let her give it back, Naomi. Please. We'll leave. You'll never see her again. Just let her take it off." "Because," Naomi said, looking over Richard's shoulder toward the grand entrance of the ballroom, "if she takes it off now, she'll be tampering with the evidence. And Captain Miller hates when people tamper with his crime scenes." As if summoned by her very words, the heavy mahogany doors of the grand ballroom swung open again. But this time, it wasn't late-arriving socialites. 4 uniformed officers of the New York Police Department stepped into the golden light of the Pierre, led by Captain Thomas Miller, a grizzled, no-nonsense veteran of the 19th Precinct who had worked with Naomi's private security chief, Gideon, on several high-profile art recovery cases in the past. They moved with quiet, terrifying purpose, not rushing, but cutting a direct path through the crowd toward the VIP section. The orchestra faltered. A cellist missed a note, then the violinist stopped entirely. The waltz died an agonizing death as a heavy, suffocating silence descended upon the ballroom. 500 of the city's wealthiest and most powerful people stopped drinking, stopped talking, and turned to watch the police march toward Richard Brown. Richard spun around, his eyes locking onto the uniforms, his knees physically buckled, hitting the edge of the table to keep himself upright. "No, no, no, no. Naomi, you didn't," he whispered, pure terror leaking from his eyes. "You called the police? Over this? It's a marital dispute. We are married." "We were married, Richard," Naomi corrected coldly. "But my family trust is a separate legal entity. A trust you are not a beneficiary of. A trust you just robbed of $3.2 million in insured assets." Captain Miller arrived at the table, his sharp eyes taking in the scene, the weeping blonde, the hyperventilating man in the tuxedo, and the immaculate, terrifyingly calm woman in white. Gideon, Naomi's security head, materialized from the crowd and stood silently behind the captain. "Mrs. Washington Brown," Captain Miller said, touching the brim of his cap. "Gideon informed me we had a grand larceny in progress. We secured the exits." "Thank you, Captain," Naomi said smoothly. "The items reported stolen from my secure vault are currently located on the person of that young woman sitting in the booth." Miller turned his gaze to Chloe, who was now openly hyperventilating, tears streaking through her heavy makeup, ruining her contour. She looked like a terrified child playing dress-up in an adult's clothes. "Miss," Captain Miller said, his voice flat, "I'm going to need you to stand up and slowly remove the necklace, the earrings, and the watch." "Officer, wait," Richard interrupted, his lawyer instincts finally misfiring in a desperate bid for survival. He stepped in front of Captain Miller, puffing out his chest. "I am Richard Brown, senior partner at Sullivan & Cromwell. This is a massive misunderstanding. These items are community property. My wife and I are having a domestic disagreement. There is no theft here. This is a civil matter, and you have no jurisdiction to intercede without a warrant." Miller didn't even blink. He looked at Richard with the distinct expression of a man scraping dog waste off his shoe. "Mr. Brown, my officers have already reviewed the sworn affidavit from the Washington Family Trust executor, along with the insurance declarations and the pre-nuptial agreement specifically detailing these items as sole, separate, and non-commingled property. We also have the biometric access logs from your apartment showing your bypass code was used at 8:14 p.m. on Thursday night, precisely when you were supposed to be en route to Phoenix." Richard's mouth opened, but no sound came out. His legal defense crumbled to dust in his throat. He looked around the room. Every prominent client he had ever represented, every judge he had ever argued before, and every senior partner at his firm was watching him. Arthur, the managing partner he had been so desperate to impress, was standing by the ice sculpture, staring at Richard with a look of absolute, career-ending disgust. "Furthermore," Miller continued, pulling a pair of steel handcuffs from his belt, the metallic click echoing loudly in the silent ballroom, "transporting stolen goods valued over $1 million across state lines, or attempting to conceal them, is a federal offense. But tonight, we'll just stick to the New York State penal law. Grand larceny in the first degree." "Richard, do something!" Chloe shrieked, finally standing up, her hands trembling violently as she fumbled with the clasp of the Empress sapphire. She couldn't undo the intricate platinum lock. "Get it off me! I don't want it!" A female NYPD officer stepped forward. "Hands away from your neck, miss. I'll handle it." The crowd watched in mesmerized horror as the female officer carefully unclasped the millions of dollars of Washington legacy from the weeping mistress. The sapphire was placed securely into an evidence bag provided by Gideon. The diamond earrings followed. Then the vintage Rolex was unbuckled from her wrist. With every piece of jewelry removed, the illusion of Richard's grandeur was stripped away. Chloe was no longer a high society darling. She was an accessory to a felony, shivering in a cheap sequined dress. "Chloe Harrington," the female officer said, pulling out a notebook. "We're going to need you to come down to the 19th precinct to make a statement regarding how you came into possession of these stolen goods. If you cooperate and prove you had no prior knowledge of the theft, the district attorney might decline to press possession charges." Chloe nodded frantically, mascara running down her cheeks in thick black rivers. She didn't look at Richard once as she was escorted away from the table by the officer, her night of high society glory ending in the back of a squad car. Then Captain Miller turned his full attention to Richard. "Richard Brown," Miller boomed, his voice carrying to every corner of the grand ballroom. "Turn around and place your hands behind your back." "Naomi," Richard begged, a single tear cutting through his foundation. "Naomi, please, don't do this. My career, my life, it's over. I'm sorry. I was stupid. I'm so sorry." Naomi looked at the man she had promised to love and cherish. She felt nothing. The space in her heart where her love for him used to reside was as empty and cold as the vault he had raided. "You aren't sorry you stole from me, Richard," Naomi said, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper, meant only for him. "You're just sorry you weren't smart enough to get away with it. You thought my family's legacy was your personal ATM. You thought you could erase my history to fund your fantasies." She stepped closer, leaning in so the scent of her Tom Ford perfume would be the last thing he smelled as a free man. "Have fun in lockup, Richard. I hear they don't serve Dom Perignon." Naomi stepped back and nodded at the captain. Miller grabbed Richard's arms, twisting them behind his back. The sharp snick-snick of the handcuffs locking into place was the loudest sound in the room. "Richard Brown, you are under arrest for grand larceny in the 1st degree," Miller recited, as he marched the disgraced lawyer through the crowd. The sea of elite society parted for them. Nobody spoke. Nobody offered to help. They simply stared as Richard Brown was paraded out of the Pierre in cuffs, his face buried in his chest, utterly destroyed. Naomi stood by the empty VIP booth, smoothing the front of her white gown. Vivian stepped up beside her, holding out a fresh glass of champagne. "Well," Vivian murmured, taking a sip from her own glass. "That was infinitely better than the opera." Naomi took the glass, her reflection staring back at her from the mirrored wall of the ballroom. The Empress Sapphire would be returned to the vault by morning, safe and secure. The divorce papers would be filed by Monday, and Richard Brown would be disbarred before the snow melted. "Yes," Naomi said, raising her glass in a silent toast to her grandfather's unyielding spirit. It was exactly the spectacle he deserved. Sunday morning in Manhattan dawned with a pale, unforgiving light. But it was nothing compared to the blinding glare of the media. By 7 a.m., the New York Post had already splashed the story across its front page, courtesy of a tipped-off hotel valet and a dozen society matrons who couldn't text fast enough. The headline read, in massive block letters, "Sapphire Scandal. Blue blood lawyer busted at the Pierre." While Richard Brown spent his Sunday trading his bespoke tuxedo for a scratchy orange Department of Corrections jumpsuit at Rikers Island, denied bail due to the sheer magnitude of the theft and his proven flight risk, Naomi was sitting at the massive oak dining table of her Upper East Side apartment. She was dressed in a pristine silk robe, sipping black coffee. Across from her sat Gideon, her security chief, and Margaret Rothschild, one of the most ruthless divorce attorneys on the Eastern Seaboard. "The jewelry is back in the vault, Mrs. Brown," Gideon said, sliding a leather-bound folder across the table. "NYPD processed it as evidence, took their macro photographs, and released it back to your custody since the chain of ownership was indisputable." "Excellent," Naomi murmured, not opening the folder. "And Richard?" "Arraigned at midnight," Margaret interjected, adjusting her reading glasses. "He entered a plea of not guilty, which is laughable. His firm, Sullivan and Cromwell, officially terminated his partnership at 6 a.m. this morning via a press release. They are cooperating fully with the district attorney to distance themselves from his radioactive fallout." Naomi nodded slowly. The vengeance felt satisfying, a cool balm over the burning betrayal. But her analytical mind, honed by years of managing a massive philanthropic empire, was snagging on a loose thread. "Margaret," Naomi said, setting her coffee cup down, "the jewelry was recovered. But what about the cash? Richard was siphoning between $5,000 and $15,000 a month from our joint operating account for the past 2 years. He claimed it was for aggressive tech investments. Chloe Harrington, the paralegal, was wearing cheap sequined dresses and flying economy. That money wasn't going to her. Where did it go? Margaret exchanged a heavy look with Gideon. Gideon cleared his throat, pulling a second, much thicker file from his briefcase. That, Gideon said, his voice dropping to a somber register, is where the situation goes from a cliché midlife crisis to a highly orchestrated parasitic fraud. We fast-tracked a forensic sweep of his personal accounts overnight. He opened the file, revealing bank statements highlighted in bright yellow, property deeds and photographs. Richard wasn't investing in Silicon Valley, Gideon explained. He was funneling the stolen joint funds into a shell corporation registered in Delaware called Blue Horizon Holdings, LLC. 2 years ago, Blue Horizon purchased a 4-bedroom, Tudor-style home in Stamford, Connecticut, in cash, $750,000. Naomi stared at the photograph of the quaint, ivy-covered house. It had a white picket fence and a Volvo parked in the driveway. A cold dread, far heavier than the shock of the stolen sapphire, began to pool in her stomach. Who lives there, Gideon? Gideon slid an 8x10 surveillance photograph across the mahogany table. It showed a woman with wavy brown hair, wearing a loose cardigan, kneeling in the front yard. She was holding a little boy who looked to be about 3 years old. The boy was laughing, his face turned toward the camera. He had Richard's jawline. He had Richard's piercing blue eyes. Her name is Lauren Davis, Gideon said softly. She is a former yoga instructor who used to teach at the studio across the street from Richard's old apartment before you two were married. The child's name is Thomas. He is 3.5 years old. Richard's name is on the birth certificate. The silence in the dining room was absolute. The ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway sounded like a judge's gavel striking wood over and over again. Naomi didn't move. She didn't blink. The puzzle pieces violently snapped together, painting a picture so grotesquely cruel it took her breath away. Richard hadn't just cheated on her. He had harbored an entire parallel existence. He had married Naomi for her pedigree, her status, and her access to limitless capital. He used the Washington family fortune to elevate himself in Manhattan society, and he actively embezzled her money to provide a comfortable, suburban life for his actual family, hidden away in Connecticut. Chloe, the paralegal at the gala, was nothing more than a recent, reckless distraction. An arrogant man getting sloppy because he believed he was untouchable. Does she know? Naomi asked, her voice dangerously quiet. Does this Lauren know he is married to me? No, Gideon replied. Our preliminary background check shows she believes Richard is a divorced, overworked corporate attorney who spends his weekdays in a small Manhattan rental near his firm and comes home to Connecticut on the weekends. The weekends you thought he was golfing with clients. Naomi closed her eyes. The sheer sociopathic audacity of the man she had shared a bed with was staggering. She took a deep, shuddering breath, the only physical manifestation of pain she would allow herself. When she opened her eyes again, the final remnants of Naomi the wife were dead and gone. Only the CEO remained. Margaret, Naomi said, tapping a manicured fingernail against the deed to the Stamford house. This Blue Horizon LLC. It was funded entirely with money embezzled from a joint account largely sustained by my family's trust dividends, correct? Yes, Margaret said, her eyes gleaming as she saw exactly where her client was going. We can prove a direct, uninterrupted paper trail from your deposits to the purchase of that property. So, Legally speaking, Naomi tilted her head, a lethal Arctic smile gracing her lips. That house belongs to me. It does, Margaret confirmed. We can file a civil asset forfeiture claim by tomorrow morning. We can freeze the LLC and assume total ownership of the deed. Do it, Naomi commanded. I want ownership of that property by Friday. I want an eviction notice taped to the front door of that Tudor house by the weekend. I don't care if she's an innocent bystander. She's living in a house built with my grandfather's sweat. Let Richard explain to his secret family why they are homeless from behind the glass of a Rikers Island visitor booth. The state of New York versus Richard Brown was not just a criminal trial. It was a societal crucifixion. Because Richard was an attorney who had routinely mocked the very prosecutors now sitting across from him, the district attorney's office offered absolutely no leniency. They pursued the grand larceny and the first-degree charge with the zeal of a holy crusade. 6 months after the gala at the Pierre, the trial commenced in a packed Manhattan courthouse. Richard looked unrecognizable. Stripped of his wealth, his prestige, and his hair dye, he sat at the defense table in a cheap, off-the-rack grey suit that hung loosely off his diminished frame. His private accounts had been completely drained by Naomi's relentless civil litigation regarding the embezzled funds. He was represented by a court-appointed attorney who looked perpetually exhausted. Naomi sat in the front row of the gallery every single day. She wore impeccably tailored Chanel suits, her posture rigid, her face an unreadable mask of regal indifference. She was the ghost of his ruined future, haunting him from 20 feet away. The prosecution's case was an absolute slaughter. Captain Miller testified about the recovery of the stolen $3.2 million jewelry. Gideon walked the jury through the biometric safe logs and the digital paper trail of the stolen funds. But the fatal blow came from an unexpected source. The prosecution called Chloe Harrington to the stand. The former mistress had struck an immunity deal. Dressed in a demure conservative blouse, a stark contrast to the crimson sequined dress from the gala, Chloe detailed how Richard had manipulated her, showering her with stolen gifts to buy her silence and affection. She wept on the stand, apologizing to Naomi directly. He told me his wife was cold, Chloe sniffled into a tissue. He said the jewelry was his grandmother's, and he wanted me to wear it because I brought warmth into his life. I never would have put it on if I knew he stole it from her safe. When it was over, it took the jury less than 3 hours to reach a verdict, guilty on all counts. At the sentencing hearing a month later, Richard was finally given the opportunity to speak. He stood up, his hands trembling as he gripped the podium. He looked directly at Naomi, his blue eyes begging for a shred of the empathy she used to possess. "Naomi, I lost everything," he choked out, crying openly in the courtroom. "I lost my career. I lost Lauren and my son. They won't even speak to me. You took the house. You took my dignity. I am a broken man. I am so deeply, truly sorry." The judge, an older, stern-faced woman, looked down at Richard with unvarnished disgust. "Mr. Brown, you are not sorry for your actions. You are grieving the loss of your unearned privilege. You used your wife as a bank, your mistresses as playthings, and your legal license as a shield. You are a disgrace to the New York bar." The judge banged her gavel. "I sentence you to 7 to 15 years in the Clinton Correctional Facility." As the bailiffs clamped the heavy steel handcuffs over Richard's wrists, Naomi stood up. She didn't gloat. She didn't smile. She simply turned her back on him and walked out of the courtroom, the heavy wooden doors closing behind her, shutting Richard Brown out of her life forever. A year later, the first Monday in May arrived in Manhattan. The Metropolitan Museum of Art was alight with flashing cameras and screaming fans for the annual Met Gala. A black Maybach pulled up to the end of the sprawling, red-carpeted steps. The door opened, and Naomi Washington stepped out. The crowd went completely silent for a fraction of a second before erupting into a deafening roar. Naomi looked like a modern-day deity. She wore a custom-designed, midnight blue velvet Schiaparelli gown that hugged her curves and pooled beautifully at her feet. But it wasn't the dress that had the paparazzi screaming her name. Resting against her collarbone, heavier and more brilliant than ever, was the Empress sapphire. The 45-carat Ceylon stone caught the strobe lights, flashing its triumphant oceanic blue across the red carpet. The matching diamond drops hung from her ears. She had reclaimed her legacy. It was no longer a symbol of her victimization. It was the ultimate armor of her survival. Earlier that morning, Naomi had announced the creation of the Washington Legal Fund, a $5 million endowment designed exclusively to pay for the law school tuition of brilliant, underprivileged black women. It was a masterstroke of philanthropy and subtle revenge, ensuring that the legal field Richard had disgraced would be flooded with women who looked like her, women who would never be manipulated by men like him. Vivienne Dupont, wearing a stunning silver Givenchy piece, met Naomi at the top of the museum steps. "Darling," Vivienne whispered, leaning in to kiss Naomi's cheek, her eyes drifting down to the massive sapphire. "You aren't just wearing history tonight, you're making it." Naomi looked out over the sea of cameras, the flashing lights reflecting in the depths of her family's $1 million jewel. She thought of her great-grandfather, buying this stone when the world told him he couldn't. She thought of Richard, rotting in a 6x8 cell upstate. "No, Jen," Naomi smiled, a genuine, radiant expression that lit up the Manhattan night. "I'm just protecting the investment." And that is exactly how you handle a thief masquerading as a husband. Naomi didn't just take out the trash, she incinerated the entire landfill. It's a chilling reminder that you never truly know who you are sleeping next to, until their hands are in your vault and their lies are exposed in the light. Have you ever caught a partner in a lie that completely shattered the reality of your relationship? How did you handle it? Let us know your wildest betrayal stories down in the comments below. If Naomi's masterclass in high society revenge had you on the edge of your seat, smash that like button and share this video with anyone who needs a reminder to always protect their peace and their assets. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss another deep dive into the darkest, most dramatic true stories of wealth, betrayal, and ultimate payback. See you in the next one.